The goal of this presentation is to answer 3 questions. What risks does a game studio face? How do you protect your game studio with the right insurance? And really, could this really happen? So developers always say, is this something I really need to worry about? We talk about all these risks, but how do they play out in the real world? I want to do this presentation by telling you a story, so I'm not just up here lecturing. So we're going to use a fictitious game company, game developer, and they're called Fractured Interactive. So based on all the research I've done, Fractured does not exist. It's not a real game company. When I do this presentation, people will always come up and say, that sounds like this game developer. Is it based on this? So the answer is no, don't read into it. Totally made this up. But it'll help us as we go through to make this more interesting, hopefully. So there's 4 areas of risk that we look at a game developer and we see that they face. So if we look at Fractured Interactive, a new game developer, a new studio, they're not really sure exactly what they want to do yet, right? They've got a game idea. Are they going to self-publish? Are they going to try and shop this around to publishers? But what are the risks they face? They start out with an idea. Well, there's IP risks. So there's risks that you face for the content of what you're creating. Contractual requirements, so if you do decide to work with a publisher, Fractured does go there, the publisher is going to have certain requirements that need to be met. And then studio and personnel, independent contractor issues, you're working with people. People always bring issues. Good, bad, there's always stuff that comes up, so how do you deal with those risks? And then consumer issues and risks. Somebody's playing your game, so how do you interact with your clients? We start out by looking at IP. So IP in game development is the copyright, the trademark, and the trade dress. So looking at like the actual content that's created. How are you going to protect that? Do you know that that's original content? What would you do if somebody came up to your studio, if someone came up to Fractured Interactive and said, hey, wait a minute, I created that content already, and then they sue you? Is there a mechanism in place to help fund or defend anything that another developer might bring against you, right? That's where the right insurance is going to come into place, and that insurance is called errors and omissions insurance. Errors and omissions insurance is also important because a lot of times you will have requirements from a publisher, right? A publisher right here.
Sure, we always require E&O.
Require E&O. So our fictitious game studio, Fractured Interactive, wants to take their game and they're going to pitch their game, and Microsoft says, yes, we love it. Well, they're going to have to meet some contractual requirements, errors and omissions, copyright, that Microsoft lays out, because Microsoft wants to shift that risk back to the developer. And they're going to say sometimes you need to carry $1 million or $2 million of errors and omissions insurance. And what you really want to focus on as a developer is making sure you're buying the right type of insurance. This is really the key takeaway, one of the key takeaways I want everyone to get. Just because something says errors and omissions is labeled that doesn't mean it's really going to cover your game. So make sure those things, copyright, trademark, and trade dress, are all in the policy. So studio personnel and independent contractors. They always are going to have issues or questions or things that can arise when you work with other people, and the best thing to do is lay all of this out up front, okay? So there's not a specific insurance that you can really buy that's going to protect you against this, but this is where we talk about the risk management piece of it and having your studio. So when we talk about our fictitious studio, Fractured, their motto is, happy people do better work, right? I think that's true for everyone. If you have happy employees, happy contractors, if everyone's on the same page, your work's going to be better, the game's going to be better. So what should you look at? Well, you need to risk manage it. Like I said, there's not a specific insurance necessarily that you're going to buy, but you need to look at things and make sure you have an employee handbook. Do you have independent contractor agreements? Are there policies and procedures in place? And this stuff, all developers, no one wants to deal with this. No one wants to look at it. I have developers that'll come to me and say, oh, I'm just making this game with my buddy, and our other friends are gonna work on it. And I'll tell you something, everything's great when it's great, but when it's bad, it goes bad really quickly and it gets really, really bad, okay? So when you have an employee handbook, it's gonna address things like, if you have people working for you, what happens if they have a conflict with another employee? That's real, that happens, right? Who do they talk to? What if they need a day off? What if they're sick? What do they do? All those policies are laid out, and if you think about that stuff ahead of time, your studio is gonna be a lot more successful in the long run. Independent contractor agreements. This one I think is key in understanding who owns the rights to your game and making sure the people you work with are giving you original content. So what I mean by that is, if you hire someone and people say, oh, they're a 1099 person, so I don't really have any liability, or they're just a contractor, so it doesn't matter. What matters even more. So if you have a contractor working for you and providing you any type of content for your game, you need to make sure that content is original content. You also need to be very clear and have it in writing who owns the content. So do you own it because you're the ultimately the developer in control of the game and they're just working on a piece of it? Are you able to use whatever that contractor creates for you in any way you want? So this comes into play a lot with music. Are you licensing music and are you able to use it the way you think you can, or is that contractor gonna come back and say, well, wait a minute, I didn't really want you to use it this way, and now that your game's really successful, I want a lot more money. So thinking about these things up front is gonna save you a lot of headaches in the long run. And again, policies and procedures, those are things we touched on a little bit that should be in the handbook. So do you have a policy in place for vacation? And again, that might be when your development studio grows a little bit, but it doesn't have to get very big before you start to run into issues where maybe you have 3 people working for you, and person 1 is working really hard and they don't think that person 2 is pulling their weight equally. Person 2 gets to leave early all the time and all this, and now all of a sudden you have 2 people that can't agree on something, butting heads, you're pulled in the middle, maybe you have a discrimination lawsuit brought against you because someone thinks you're favoring somebody else, and all of these things only because you didn't have a written policy in place that could have solved it all from the start. So again, think about that. When we talk about happy employees, doing the best work, being the best employees, obviously as game developers and when you're bringing people on, you want to attract and retain the best talent in the industry. Well, there's lots of different ways to do that, right? And you want to create a good work environment. You want to offer all the benefits that you can, the extra little things. Employee benefits, health insurance is a really good way to do that. So as a broker, we help developers buy their insurance and structure their benefit plans. And I can tell you that's the #1 thing. No one wants the headache of trying to figure out, how does my health insurance work? Do I have it? What happens if I get sick? I don't know, who's gonna pay for it? So if you can structure this and work with a broker to get the right things in place, you're gonna have employees who know how to use their health insurance, who aren't worried about getting sick and not being able to pay for it, and who know if they do get hurt on the job that there's workers' compensation insurance in place, that there's ways to address issues that may happen or arise at the studio. Workers' compensation is on here just because I felt really strongly about not leaving it off, simply because it's required by law in a lot of states. And a lot of small developers will say, I don't need to pay for that, I don't want it. You have to. It's really, really inexpensive. And again, if you have a work comp claim, the question's gonna be, it's probably gonna put you out of business if you don't have the right insurance, right? We'll talk about the costs of what these claims look like in a minute. But again, it's ensuring ahead of time that your studio can stay afloat by funding these things through the vehicle of insurance. So, consumer risks. People play your games. That's the ultimate goal, right? That's the point. Well, how do you interact with your players? Is your game downloadable? What happens if you send 1 million people a virus through your game? What's gonna happen? You're gonna have a lot of really angry customers, people are gonna sue you. Are you just out of business then? what type of information do you collect from the players? So if you're asking for any type of identifiable information, name, zip code, if you're collecting credit card data or even appearing to collect credit card data through your game, you have a cyber liability risk. You have a big one. And when I say appearing to collect cyber liability, appearing to collect credit card information, let's say you have your game up and you have a third-party site that's really processing all the credit card information, so you're not taking it in, but there's a third party that's doing it. If someone goes to your website or downloads your game or whatever it is, and they think they're paying you for anything, the court's going to argue that you are responsible for that identifiable information. So what's your plan if there's a breach, right? We've seen breaches. Sony just had a big cyber breach. If it can happen to a big company, it can obviously happen to a small developer easily. So again, think ahead, plan ahead for what you're going to do. And then the monkey see, monkey do theory. You've got clients, you've got customers who are playing your game, and let's say you've created a very dynamic game and there's all this really cool stuff in it. Well, what happens if somebody replicates it? So you've got people jumping off a building in your game and it's awesome and they fly, and what happens if a kid says, oh, I'm going to go do that. I'm going to jump off the building and I think I can fly because I saw it in a game. Are you responsible for it? Maybe. You can certainly be sued for it, and it happens all the time. So how do you cover that? That's going to be covered in something called general liability, but again, you want to make sure those things aren't excluded when you look to purchase insurance. So there's different types of policies that are going to interact with your studio, interact with different pieces of what you're doing. So far we've talked about the errors and omissions insurance, right, for copyright stuff, liability, if somebody tries to replicate something they see in your game. Liability also covers things like what happens if your game development studio has a fire. You've maybe put all your money into your startup, and if you don't insure it the right way and it burns down, how are you going to keep going? What about all the content you've created? Is it lost? What do you do? And then cyber insurance, insuring against that privacy information, so the identifiable data that you collect from your customers. So people always say, could this really happen to me? And we briefly talked about this fictitious game studio that's getting set up, and these are the risks that they would face and they would want to look at. Whether they're deciding, do we self-publish? Do we go with a publisher? How do we make our game accessible to people? What do we do? But real-world experiences. So could this really happen to me? Yes. And we're going to talk about two larger examples, two larger companies that actually one had a errors and omissions breach, a copyright issue, or a possible issue, and one had a general liability issue. So in 1982, there was an issue with Nintendo and Donkey Kong, okay? Copyright. So obviously we have Universal claiming that Donkey Kong was based on King Kong, okay? And they said, you can't make this game anymore, we want it to stop, or we want a bunch of money. This is Universal saying this to Nintendo. And Nintendo said no, and they fought it. And in this case, Nintendo won. It was proven that there was no copyright infringement, okay? But just because they won doesn't mean it didn't cost a lot of money to fight this, to defend this. Now, in this case, Universal did have to go back and pay for a lot of those damages and legal fees, but you have to put that money up out front. You have to put that money out up front or fold if you're a developer. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't have all that money in the bank just sitting there that I want to spend on a lawsuit, or that I could spend if somebody sued me because they said I infringed upon their game. So remember, a copyright lawsuit doesn't always even have to be true. It's just if somebody accuses you and says, hey, wait a minute, that was my IP, that was my content. Go ahead.
So what would happen if then Nintendo got, attorney's fees from Universal? Would they pay that back to the insurer?
So in this case, yes. So Nintendo had insurance. There was money that was put out. Policies paid. I'm sure, I don't know all of the details about this specifically. I'm sure Nintendo put some of their own money up. There's always deductibles and things like that. But yeah, the insurance companies would subrogate against each other, so Universals and Nintendos, and then they'd pay each other back. But does anybody want to guess so this is 1982, what the discovery phase, the lawsuit, just what they spent on this, what Nintendo spent in 82? $2 million? Just over 1.8. So in 82, so extrapolate that out, we're like $25–30 million today. These lawsuits can get crazy expensive quickly. Okay, now remember, that's Nintendo. Anything could happen, so there's a certain place you have to get to where you decide, okay, I'm going to spend this much on premium, and these are the limits I'm going to get. You can't insure for everything, and you can't have $100 million limits, right? So you have to figure out what level of risk you're comfortable with. I'm not suggesting you're going to get sued for $50 million tomorrow, and you need to be scared of stuff like that, but it's just stuff to think about. And the bigger your game gets, the more of a hit it is, the more people who are going to come after and say you're infringing on their copyright or IP. So another example, this is more of a general liability issue or a physical issue like we talked about. So a 13-year-old boy was unfortunately killed. His best friend stabbed him, did something he saw in the Mortal Kombat game. This is back in '97. The victim's mom sued and said that her son's killer went crazy, was influenced by Mortal Kombat, and this is what happened. So again, both Midway had to pay to defend the lawsuit, right? It was ultimately determined that they were not at fault, but a lot of money was spent, and actually the sums on this one are undisclosed, and some things were settled, and they were found that they did not do anything wrong, but it still costs a lot of money to defend this kind of stuff, okay? Those are two examples from more than about 20 years ago, 30 years ago at this point. So I wanted to give you an example of what median costs of a claim look like today. And this is IP related, so this goes back to our copyright, trademark stuff. And this is across multiple industries, not just the games industry, but it gives you an example. If you have a trademark claim, the top graph is showing you just the discovery phase. So this is even before it gets to court. Before anything happens, the lawyers are discovering, saying, did you really infringe on my copyright? Is there really an issue? If someone's suing you for $1 million, it's going to cost you about $150,000. And I'll tell you, when people say, I'm going to sue you for this much, they don't really say, I'm going to sue you for $1 million. They go for I'm going to sue you for $25 million. It always starts out in these grandiose, great numbers, right? And scales down. But then when you go all in, the second chart shows you the numbers all in, you can see if you have a $1 million claim and it goes to court and you have to pay the legal fees and then some settlement and discovery and expert witnesses and all of that, you're looking at $800,000. That's a lot of money. So understanding and purchasing the right insurance, managing your risks ahead of time, having those agreements in place with contractors, making sure you can use the content that you have licensed in the right way. That's all the stuff that you want to do to prevent a claim, and then have the insurance in place if it happens, and you know that it's going to pay if you need it to, right? We can't guarantee that everything's always covered in insurance. There's no insurance that you're going to buy that just says, yes, anything that happens will be covered. But the more knowledgeable you are about what you're purchasing and about what's in that contract, the more likely that you're going to have coverage at the time of needing it. So 3 things to remember. Know your risks. Know what's ahead of you. Think this through. Plan ahead. But obviously you need to be able to adjust, because like we talked about with our game studio, you may not know today what you want to do. As a developer, maybe you think you want to self-publish and then this new opportunity comes along, so you have to be ready to adjust and change your course of action, right? And then work with the experts. Find a lawyer, find an attorney up front who specializes in games, who can help you get your studio going the right way, make sure everything's licensed and done appropriately. I can't tell you how many times I'll start to work with developers and they'll tell me, my attorney is the same guy who did my will. And I look at them, I'm like, oh my goodness, okay, I'm sure he's really nice or she's really nice, but you have to work with the experts. Same thing with insurance. Find a broker who understands the games industry and can help you with this, help point you in the right direction. Find those trusted advisors, people who have already developed games, people at the publishers. The publishers are your friend and want to help you with this stuff when you're working together. So get their advice, figure out how you can best prepare ahead of time to make sure you're doing everything the way you can. And then, you know, stuff happens. That's why you have insurance. So you can do everything right and still have a claim or still have a loss, but at least you know you've got everything in line and it will hopefully go smooth. One other resource that I want to share with you is a really great book. It's by the American Bar Association, and the second edition's coming out this fall. Full disclosure, I did write a chapter in it about insurance, but this is really a step-by-step American Bar Association, the legal guide to video development, a step-by-step for a startup developer to understand what risks they face. How do you start a studio? There's a lot of great, really in-depth stuff in this book about copyrights, patents. It's just a fabulous resource, and we're working really hard with the publisher to get a discount code for IGDA members, so check the website. We just don't have a publication date yet for exactly when that will be out, but it should be soon. So that's what I have today. I wanted to leave about 6 minutes left for questions. This is all of my contact information if you guys have specific questions. We are the official partner with the IGDA for their insurance, so this is all on the IGDA website as well. And I really appreciate your time today. So thank you very much. Do you have any questions that I can answer? Yes?
Is there an insurance for when you have a contract with a client and then the client goes bankrupt before they can fulfill the contract?
So there's bonding, that's a bond that you can get. It can be a little complicated to get that. It's not, or collect on it, I should say, but it is possible. They're just gonna underwrite the financials of your client, so they're gonna need to see more information than just from you as the person purchasing the bond. Yeah.
So how feasible is insurance for a small studio, say of 2 or 3 people?
So, great question. A little bit of background about how I started in this industry. So about 8 years ago, we saw the issue of it not being feasible at all. So a developer would come to me as a broker. Brokers help purchase insurance. So we go to the insurance companies and try and put together the best package, the best insurance program at the best price on your behalf. And what I kept running into was, gosh, this is really expensive. How in the world is a 2-person studio going to pay $25,000 to insure the trademark and copyright on their game? And I didn't really like the contracts that were even out there. So the policies that were being sold, quite frankly, weren't the best. So I created a program called GameGuard to address exactly your concern. They're all individually underwritten, so I can't tell you it would cost you, $2,000, but it's cost effective. The policies are manuscripts, so you're able to include exactly what a game developer would need and strip out all that other stuff. Okay, so that's the problem I was seeing in the past. Underwriters didn't understand what a game developer did. So when an underwriter doesn't understand something, they throw their hands up and say, I can't write it, or they just make it too expensive. In the past, policies were including things like credit card processing or weird tech things that maybe a software developer needed. But the truth is, a game developer is a software designer and an entertainment company. And you have to look at that risk right that way. So why should you pay for credit card processing if you're not doing it? Take that out and buy a cyber policy if you decide to do it. So we drilled down, created the copyright coverage, the E&O, and the general liability on one form, and it's really affordable. So, yeah. Yes, oh, we'll go back there and then up front. Go ahead.
What kind of insurance would you recommend for freelancers?
So it depends It depends exactly what you're doing. Are you creating content and then letting somebody else own that? Are you creating your own stuff? What are you?
I'm creating content for someone else.
For someone else. So I would recommend that somebody else really gets the insurance. You know, obviously, if you start to create things and do something with it that's your own, you know, then you would need insurance. If you're signing any type of contract that warns that you have insurance, you need to get it. Sometimes developers will come to me and say, oh yeah, my publisher or whoever, they just never look. And so I tell them I have $2 million of insurance, but I don't. Well, that's a really slippery slope if there's a claim, because you've told someone you have it, you've agreed that your insurance will pay the whatever, $2 million, $1 million if there's a claim, and then what? What happens if you don't have that policy? So, you know, again, I'd say we can talk more specifically about like projects you're working on, but unless you're signing contracts, you know, or working on things that require the insurance, you don't really need it right now. I mean, obviously, health insurance and all that is a whole different animal, but when you start doing your own stuff or self-publishing or whatever it is, that's when you need it.
So can you talk about how this insurance works when you've got international clients and, you know, the differing laws about IP and all that stuff? Like if I'm in Hong Kong where allegedly they don't enforce anything?
Right.
How does that work?
So the policies worldwide, it's going to be based on the content of the U.S. contract, the insurance contract. And you're right, in places like Hong Kong, it can be difficult to enforce. But if you're a U.S.-based company and you know someone from Hong Kong's infringing upon your copyright, the policy's going to kick in and help pay to defend or do whatever needs to be done. Or if somebody from Hong Kong accuses you of copyright infringement, the policy would be there. Now, a company that's solely based in China or, you know, somewhere else doing work overseas, they probably aren't going to buy this because they don't value that copyright insurance or infringement issues the same way, unless they start to work with a U.S. publisher that says you have to have it. So. Does that answer your question? Good. Okay, one more question. Yep, go ahead. Yeah, that's you.
How do these policies handle the different sort of stages of litigation? Are there incentives to settle,
Yeah, so the insurance companies really, they need to be involved early on a potential claim, right? And they're going to work with you to figure out if settling is the best option because it's going to be more affordable and also take up a lot less time because as you can imagine, it's not just a hard dollar cost. Think about all the time you'd have to spend on a claim that's going to pull you away from actually doing your work. So it's always handled on a case-by-case basis, but the insurance company will get involved immediately if there's a claim and then work to figure out if they can settle it, keep it out of court, how can we resolve this to make both parties happy? The goal is to do it as quickly as possible.
and so just a quick follow-up, does the insurance company take the claim, they hire the lawyer, or does you as the policyholder?
It's a really good question. So the insurance company works with a team of lawyers who they call panel counsel. So people that they've already predetermined, understand your risk, video games, and would be equipped to handle that. If you have an attorney that you want to work with, I always advise my clients, if you have a relationship, you have that person written into the policy, so actually named in the policy before you, or as you're purchasing, so before there's a claim. It's just a lot easier. If you didn't know who the attorney was and you said, hey, I want so-and-so to be my attorney if there is a claim, the insurance company will absolutely consider it. I don't know if they're going to agree, but they're just going to want to vet that person and make sure they have the right experience, they know what they're doing in the games industry before they say, you know, yes, and they're going to look at their rates and make sure they're all in line. So they consider all of that. So. Well, thank you again. I think we're about out of time. If anybody else has any other questions, I'm here for the rest of the day and tomorrow, so please feel free to come up and ask. Thanks.